Hey, all. Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to Montgomery, Alabama in early February 1861, where Southern patriotism and revolutionary fervor burned bright as representatives from 6 states convened to draft and adopt a provisional Confederate Constitution. The mobilization of troops had already gained momentum across Alabama and the rest of the South, where just a month earlier, state militia occupied federal forts Gaines and Morgan at Mobile Bay, plus a nearby arsenal. Local leaders rallied their communities to defend the emerging nascent republic. In Wilcox County, 75 miles from the activity in Montgomery, an infantry company, a militia company, was born. About 100 enthusiastic volunteers signed up. One of those young men who rose to lead them was 20-year-old David Wardlaw Ramsey. He's a graduate of the Kentucky Military Institute and the son of a prosperous Methodist minister who owned a plantation and more than 50 enslaved people. Ramsey suspended his studies to become a physician and enlisted as a first lieutenant on February 9th in this new militia company that happened to be the same day that Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederate States of America. Ramsey and his comrades marched out of the county 3 days later with their spirited name, the Wilcox True Blues. They weren't alone with interesting, unique names. They joined companies from other counties with colorful titles, such as the Talladega Rifles, Guards of the Sunny South, Rough and Ready Pioneers, and the Red Eagles. Together, these militia companies formed a regiment, the 1st Alabama Infantry. The rank and file elected staff officers, which was a common practice among volunteers. They voted the captain of the True Blues as lieutenant colonel. When he left to assume his new duties, Ramsey advanced from lieutenant to captain and company commander. The men mustered in for a 1-year term of enlistment. The unique company names were replaced by less exciting letters, but nonetheless important to the men. The True Blues would be officially referred to in future orders and reports from the regiment as Company K. And after some reorganizations, they became Company B of the regiment. The True Blues kept their company flag, which is a blue silk standard trimmed with gold fringe. Tradition has it that local women cut the material from a donated dress. A county man, a painter, born in England, had decorated it with a cotton bloom and landscapes. On one side, he added gold letters that spelled out the company name, followed by, quote, "Woman's Offering to Patriotism," end quote. A Latin phrase appeared on the other side of the flag, and it was a warning to invaders, quote, "Don't touch me," unquote. Those raw recruits prepared to defend the homeland with their new flag and echoed a refrain common across the South. Quote, "When we volunteered, we thought we could whip the Yankees in 3 months," end quote, stated one private who happened to write a history of the regiment later on. The private continued, quote, "Most of these young men were from homes of wealth and culture, of the best Southern families, and inflamed with resentment against the North for long continued aggressions upon the rights of the South, as well as by the recent John Brown raid in Virginia," end quote. He further noted that less privileged soldiers, quote, "who, with no property interest involved, equaled the zeal and loyalty of their wealthy comrades in devotion, courage, sacrifice, and duty," end quote. A number were students who were at one time armed with textbooks. Quote, "We had several scholarly teachers in the regiment," end quote, observed the private turned historian. Quote, we expected to fight the Yankees and pursue our studies at the same time, end quote. There'd be little room for book learning as tough times lay ahead. Stationed in Florida along Pensacola Bay, their first enemy was disease. Measles, malaria, and typhoid fever swept the regiment in epidemic proportions. As the death toll mounted, the men became indifferent to the sight of the corpses of their comrades on their way to makeshift cemeteries for burial or for shipment to grieving families back home. The regiment's historian recalled that one nervous soldier observed, quote, a man can die and be buried here with the least ceremony and concern I ever saw, end quote. Despite raging sickness, the troops became so proficient at working the big guns in area forts and batteries that they converted from infantry to artillery. They reverted to foot soldiers on one night, October 8th to 9th, 1861, and participated in a 1,200-man amphibious raid on Santa Rosa Island, where the Confederates overran and burned the camp of the 6th New York Infantry before Union reinforcements arrived and drove them back. The True Blues suffered one casualty, a drummer boy accidentally shot in the leg during the withdrawal. The regiment's enlistment, that original one-year enlistment, expired in early 1862. Ramsey and many of the patriotic members of the True Blues reenlisted. Fresh recruits joined them, including Ramsey's little brother, 18-year-old Rob, and Rob and others replaced those who had died of disease or decided that they had had enough of the war after that first year's enlistment. The Alabamians, hence reinforced, departed the warm climate of Florida for the cold, inhospitable conditions of a nondescript sandbar in the Mississippi River labeled on maps as Island Number 10. This was the last in a chain of numbered islands. It sat at the base of a horseshoe-shaped bend near New Madrid, Missouri. The Confederate-held defenses on the island lay in the path of Union forces who were intent on splitting the Confederacy in two along the Great Waterway. Another round of disease decimated the regiment for the second time in little more than a year. The sick were housed in hospitals established in a church and on a steamboat anchored near Island Number 10. On the ship, according to one eyewitness, quote, the men were lying on the floor across the cabin, head to wall and feet to feet, with a space of 12 or 18 inches between each. They all had pneumonia, and the space between each man was literally covered with the expectorant by the patients. The same was the case in the aisle, which was about 3 feet wide. The coughing, wheezing, and groans were distressing, end quote. The situation grew even more desperate when the Federals moved in. The Confederates were compelled to surrender on April 8th, 1862. Ramsey, his True Blues, and the rest of the 1st Alabama were among the 3,500 prisoners. The Alabamians spent the day in conversation with their Union captors. The Federals, quote, repelled as an insult the least insinuation that the war, professedly for the Union, involved the emancipation of slaves, declaring they would lay down their arms at once if they had the remotest apprehension that such was the case. Though doubtless sincere at the time, they did not make good this declaration upon the issuance of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 9 months later, end quote. That quote from the regimental historian. The captured officers were separated from the enlisted men, a common practice during the war. Ramsey and his fellow officers went to a prison camp on Johnson's Island in Ohio. His brother Rob, who's in the ranks, went to Camp Butler in Illinois. He didn't survive. He didn't survive his time at Camp Butler. He died there of disease. The flag, that blue banner with the gold trim that the True Blues carried into battle, was surrendered with them, and it fared somewhat better. Wisconsin troops stripped it from the company color bearer and sent it home as a war trophy. The flag later became part of a display in a museum in Madison, Wisconsin. 5 months after his imprisonment, Ramsey gained his release in a prisoner exchange and returned to duty along the Mississippi River, only to suffer surrender and capture a second time. He was in command of an artillery battery at Port Hudson, Louisiana, when he and the True Blues successfully defended the city and the river from several major Union assaults. But after Major General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, the position at Port Hudson became untenable, and approximately 5,500 men in gray became prisoners. That was on July 9th, 1863. Now, Union forces controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in twain. The enlisted men, released on parole, eventually returned to duty. But for Ramsey and the other captured officers, their fighting was over. The war was ended for them. After a prison stint in New Orleans, where Ramsey stood in this picture, Napoleon style, he returned to Johnson's Island for a second time and remained in captivity for the duration of the war. Altogether, Ramsey spent about 2 years in prison before military authorities released him. It was in June of 1865. At that time, he returned to Wilcox County, married in 1866, and converted to his wife's Baptist faith. Together, they started a family that grew to include 5 daughters and 3 sons. He eventually completed his medical studies, the ones he had paused to join the Army back in 1861. And once he completed his studies, he opened a medical practice. He did that for a while and eventually was ordained a minister. It was in 1883, and turned his attention to the spiritual needs of his patients. In 1893, 10 years after he became a minister, typhoid claimed the life of his wife and a daughter. He remarried the following year and lived a long life, dying in 1916. 1 year after he died, survivors of the True Blues learned that silk banner, that beloved blue and gold trim banner, the one that they had assumed lost after Island number 10, was in the museum in Wisconsin. They sent a delegation to negotiate its return, and that was successfully completed in 1921, almost 60 years after it was captured. Had he lived, Ramsey might not have been eager to see the flag. According to Ramsey's great-grandson, Joel Wardlaw Ramsey of Dothan, Alabama, Ramsey was, quote, a healer, a man of peace, trying to get beyond being a soldier, end quote. There's an anecdote in the family's oral history that illustrates Ramsey's state of mind. His granddaughter wore a blue dress, of which she was very proud, so the story goes. It brought her many compliments, with the exception of one person. That was Ramsey. He remarked that he didn't care much for the color blue. Telling. But on a February day in 1861, in Wilcox County, in the heat of the moment and the passion of the times, the looming war was more abstraction than reality. And the banner, that banner of the True Blues, floated over Ramsey and his comrades. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.